Good evening and welcome to the Richard Barnett Memorial Lecture, which will be given by our very distinguished speaker and colleague, Professor Hugh Williamson. My name's Sarah Pearce, and it's my privilege on behalf of the Anglo-Israel Archaeological Society to introduce proceedings as we honor the memory of Dr. Richard David Barnett, the founder and prolific builder of our society, until his death in 1986 at the age of 77. In the late 1950s, soon after his appointment as the first keeper of the Department of Western Asiatic Antiquities at the British Museum, Richard Barnett began to work with colleagues to provide support and encouragement from Britain for archaeological activities in Israel. This was a time, of course, of growing interest and excitement about the discoveries being made in the early years of the new state. Richard Barnett's work led to the founding of the Anglo-Israel Archaeological Society in 1961, with the goals of informing public and professionals about new developments in archaeological work in Israel, a lecture program about discoveries to be delivered by world-leading experts in the field, and a program of travel grants to support students of Middle Eastern archaeology. It was made very clear from the beginning that the Society holds no religious or political affiliation and is open to all who are interested, professional and amateur. This memorial lecture falls this year on the day that would have marked Richard Barnett's birthday. And on behalf of the Society, we extend our very best wishes to Richard's wife, Barbara Barnett, and his 3 children, Celia, Colin, and Robbie. After the death of Richard Barnett, a fund was established to provide annual lectures to preserve the memory of the remarkable breadth and depth of his scholarly contributions in fields beyond his stellar career as keeper of Western Asiatic antiquities in the British Museum. The lectures were originally intended to rotate between 3 of the institutions to which Richard Barnett made major contributions: the Anglo-Israel Archaeological Society, our society, which he founded and served as chair for 18 years, the Jewish Historical Society of England, where Richard Barnett served as president and honorary editor of publications, and the Spanish and Portuguese Jews Congregation, where he served for many years as the honorary archivist. In recent years, the lectures have been delivered to the Anglo-Israel Archaeological Society and the Jewish Historical Society of England in alternate years, with the subject of the Jewish Historical Society lecture often related to the Western Sephardi tradition to which Richard Barnett devoted so much of his scholarship. It is our hope that the tradition of these lectures will continue to keep alive the memory of a great scholar in perpetuity. And so it is our great honor to welcome Professor Hugh Williamson to deliver the Richard Barnett Memorial Lecture. Hugh Williamson studied theology as an undergraduate and graduate student in Cambridge before teaching Hebrew and Aramaic in the Faculty of Oriental Studies there from 1975 to 1992. He became Regius Professor of Hebrew in Oxford and a student of Christ Church until 2014, the date of his retirement. He was elected a Fellow of the British Academy in 1993 and appointed OBE in the 2015 New Year's Honours List for services to scholarship and theology. His very many outstanding distinctions outside his own university include service as Vice President of the British Academy. At a relatively early point in his career, and as one of few British scholars of the Hebrew Bible who was actively engaged in archaeological work in Israel, Hugh was invited by Richard Barnett to join the committee of the Anglo-Israel Archaeological Society. Hugh subsequently served as chair of the society for 19 years as the 3rd chair of the society, and is now our very distinguished and hugely supportive vice president. In her history of the society, Barbara Barnett says that the influence of the early chairs, including Hugh, can be seen in the caliber of the professionals who address the Society on their archaeological and scholarly work. And we see this year on year with Hugh's ever generous efforts to bring to the Society the very best speakers and the very best archaeologists to work with our sponsored students. In the first part of his scholarly career, Hugh's research focused with monographs and commentaries on the books of Chronicles and of Ezra and Nehemiah. Since then, he's focused on the book of Isaiah with several monographs and a 3-volume commentary on the Hebrew text of chapters 1 to 27. In addition to his work on the text and philology, Hugh's work also engages with historical concerns informed by his experience over many years in excavations at Lachish and Jezreel in Israel. If you don't know Hugh and you want to learn more about the extraordinary breadth of his activity as a teacher of Hebrew Bible in very many different contexts, I hope he won't mind my saying that may I recommend an interview in the Church Times in which he revealed much of interest, but I was particularly struck by a comment at the end in which he was asked with whom he would choose to be locked in a church, and he chose St. Jerome. And he says, from what I can gather about Jerome's character, I am sure we should have the most almighty row, but I should love to talk with him about translating and commenting on the Old Testament. Questions after this lecture are warmly encouraged, after which I will ask our former chair, Professor Tessa Rajak, to give the vote of thanks. So may I pass over to you, Hugh, and thank you very much for giving your lecture on Scrolls and Scribes. How well has the Bible survived? Thank you.
Well, thank you for that very generous introduction. For reasons that we've never been able to discover, the pictures have to be controlled by Rachel. So Rachel, if we could have the first one up, please, I should be grateful. As Sarah's already said, it's the Richard Barnett Memorial Lecture. And it's lovely that I think I saw on the list of participants that Barbara is with us this evening. So Barbara, it's lovely that you're able to join us. I indeed joined the committee by invitation when Richard was still the chair. And I have to say, committee meetings under Richard's chairmanship were marvellous, because we met in the home, Roberta Harris, I see, is here, she'll remember this, of one of the trustees who was extremely generous with her hospitality. And Richard very briefly told us what was going to happen, and we all said, yes, jolly good. And then we had a very pleasant party for the rest of the evening. So I remember that with great affection. And I didn't know Richard, obviously, in his earlier days, but I'm glad to share in his memory. And I should say that given the wide range of people attending, this lecture presupposes very little knowledge. And so for those of you who are scholars in the field, I'm afraid you won't learn much, but hopefully you'll enjoy the pictures. Next, please. We have a Bible. And here's an English Bible. As I sometimes joke with the children, you can tell it's a holy Bible because it's got coloured edges and is in a soft leather binding. And that English translation, where does it come from? How do we get to the kind of Bible one might read or buy in a bookshop or whatever? Well, next, please. It's a translation of the Hebrew Bible, and this is a picture just of the standard edition that we use these days. When I was still teaching, this would be the text that one would work through with the students and so on. Most of it is just the text, and there's a sort of comments in the bits down at the bottom where there are various variations that we may come to think about in a moment. And that text is as exact a copy as they can make it of, next please, this scroll, known as Leningradensis, because it was named when it was in Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, but they haven't decided to change the name. And this is the first complete manuscript that we have of the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. and our English or other language translations are usually a translation, as far as one can manage, of this particular text. Now, the date of this, there are 3 dates that are given in the course of the scroll, but it's around about 1004 of the Common Era. So about 14, 15, 1600 years after some of it was written, which is actually quite a long time. But this is the Bible, as it were, which is translated for us into English. Now, what's the earliest bit of the Bible we've got? Let's have the next picture, please. Those of you who know Jerusalem will recognize this view from, as it were, the old city, looking across the valley to what is known as the Scottish Hospice or St. Andrew's Church. You can see the flag flying proudly there. When I first went as a student to Jerusalem with my wife and then 3-month-old oldest child, we spent our first few nights in the Scottish Hospice and were very nicely looked after there. And so to speak, underneath it, down below, there are some caves which turned out to be unpilfered graves from around about the years 700 to 600 before the Common Era. Pretty well all tombs in and around Jerusalem were robbed long ago, but these ones were not. And they were excavated by a good friend who's often lectured to us in the society here, Gabi Barkai. And mercifully, amongst those working with him was another dear friend, Judith Hadley, who mercifully picked up what looked like a cigarette butt, which most volunteers would simply have thrown away. But she knew better. And it turned out to be a little rolled up silver amulet. If we have the next slide, please, you'll see a picture of it. There it is on the left-hand side of the picture. When it was unrolled, you can imagine it all rolled up. And you can see some scratches on it, which have now been picked out in the picture on the right-hand side. But I well remember when Gabi first found this, and there's another scroll like it, which I'm not showing you, but it's very similar, because we were working under David Osishkin's direction at the site of Lachish or Lachish, and Gabi had found this along with tremendous find of pottery, over 1,000 pieces of most beautifully preserved pottery and so on. But he had got someone to trace out the copies, and he brought it to show us all and ask us what we thought it was. And we all looked and tried to be very learned and had to confess we hadn't got a clue, because it was impossible early on to distinguish between what were letters and what were simply scratch marks and so on. And in the copy we were shown, they were all jumbled up together and you couldn't make out anything. But over the course of time, and after a lot of trial and error, the rather redoubtable reader of such materials, Ada Yardeni, managed to realize what were letters and what were other scratches, and was able then to come up eventually with a reading, which we can see in the next picture. And you see the scroll on the right. The next one is the Leningrad Codex, the second from the right, which is the biblical text. And then we've got the scroll and an English translation on the left-hand side. And if you look sort of down towards the bottom part, it's almost identical with the priestly blessing in the book of Numbers, chapter 6. May the Lord bless you, keep you, make his face shine upon you, and grant you peace. And so this little silver amulet, which will have been worn around the neck, people often wear little religious symbols, don't they, still to this day? And that would have been worn. And it's the earliest bit of Bible that we've got. Now, of course, there was no Bible then, and it's not quoted from the Bible. It was a priestly blessing that was no doubt familiar from the temple or other liturgy, and which came to also be included in the Bible. So we have here something from around about 600 BCE. And then we have the manuscript from which our Bibles are translated about 1600 years later. And the question is, how do we fill that huge gap between the time when the Bible was being written, and it was mostly finished by around 300 BCE, some bits are a bit later, but also obviously all before the Christian era. How do we fill the gap between that time of writing and the manuscript from which our English or other languages are taken? Well, now, if we have the next slide, I've tried to do a sort of timeline. Starting at the top left, you've got the complete, as it's known, Masoretic manuscript. Then from the 7th century, we have manuscripts from the famous Cairo Geniza, on which we've had lectures in the Society from time to time. They're not complete. There are many of them, but they are at least copies of Hebrew Bible, bits of the Hebrew Bible. And then going earlier, we have translations of the Hebrew Bible into other languages. First of all, the Aramaic Targum, or I should say plural really, Targumim, Targums, which were written over the course of many centuries, primarily for use in teaching and for readings in the synagogue. They're very interesting. Some of them keep quite close to the text of the Bible as we know it. Other bits might wander off into paraphrase and comment and so on. So they don't always tell us exactly what the text was that the people responsible for the Targum were working on, but sometimes they give us a good clue. Then we're on to firmer ground, around about 400, the Vulgate. Jerome, who Sarah mentioned, I mean, he was a very interesting chap. And as you know, he translated from the Hebrew into Latin. Previously, the Christian church had relied on a Greek translation, which was then translated into Latin. But Jerome said, no, that's no good. You've got to go back to the original. So he gave us a translation of the Bible as he knew it, working that time mainly in Bethlehem and with Jewish people, of course, to help him learn Hebrew. And it's a pretty close equivalent of our later Masoretic manuscript, but there are some differences here and there, and it's interesting to think about that. Then, I mean, these dates are very approximate. Around 200, we have what's called the Peshitta, which is the Syriac Bible. Now, the Syriac language, it's a version of Aramaic, but was used particularly in the early Eastern Christian church. And so that's getting earlier. And then if you go up onto the right-hand side, we have the Dead Sea Scrolls that I'm going to talk about more in a minute, from before the year 70. And there's lots of bits of Bible there. And then the earliest evidence we have actually is from the translation into Greek, known as the Septuagint, from around about 300 to 100 BCE. And one can have a look at how the Bible was translated then into Greek. And again, most of the time it's very recognizable, but sometimes there's a word here or a phrase there that might be different. And it's obviously interesting to speculate as to whether the word was different in the Hebrew that the Greek person was translating from the one that we're familiar with. Now, that's the sort of evidence that we have available. And what can it tell us? Well, let's go and work backwards. Let's go back to our Masoretic manuscripts. We could have the next picture, please. I show this out of piety because this is part of it was originally 30. It's now 8-volume edition of the Hebrew Bible by the great Oxford scholar Benjamin Kennicott. Now, those of you who saw the poster for this lecture, we had a picture from the Kennicott Bible, That's not to be confused with this. I mean, it's a manuscript and very important as such, and beautifully decorated, as we see. But what Kennicott was trying to do here was to put together all the Masoretic manuscripts, including the one that I showed you originally, but also literally hundreds of others. And you've got the text up at the top, and you can see how the bottom 2/3 of the page have got lots of notes where there might be a difference between one manuscript and another. Now, although there are so many manuscripts that are compared down to the time when printing became common, the fact of the matter is that there are actually only very minor differences for the most part. I'll come to indicate a little bit what that's something to do. The vowel, we'll have to say something about vowels in a minute, and they're written with dots and dashes, and sometimes there might be a difference of a vowel here or there. Sometimes the words are spelt differently. Before anybody thought of inventing a dictionary, spelling of Hebrew, as of other languages, was a bit flexible and fluid, and so you get differences with spelling of the same word. Things like that. Very, very small differences that don't make a great deal of difference in the wider scheme of things. But anyway, Kennicott and about a century later, a chap called De Rossi compiled all the Masoretic manuscripts, all the manuscripts that existed before printing from about the year 1000 for the next 200 or 300 years. And the amount of work must have been terrific. The net result was actually important in its own way, but doesn't make a great deal of difference to the text of the Bible. Now, let's have a look at the next picture. This is a Masoretic manuscript, and these are the kind of things that Kennicott was reading. And as you will see, even if you don't know Hebrew, you've got the consonants in the bold script, and then there are lots of little dots and dashes, as I call them, which mostly mark the vowels, because most of the Hebrew is consonantal, the consonants only. But there are also little lines and marks which indicate how you should divide the sentence up into its halves and where the end of a sentence comes, and things like that. We'll say a bit more about that in a moment.
Oh, look, it's Layla.
But the
Layla.
if we may contrast that with the next picture, which is, if we could have the next one, please. Yes, I think you've jumped one. Yes, this one. Now, this is a manuscript of part of the book of Leviticus from among the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it's one of the earliest Bible scrolls from the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, I don't know whether you can pick it out, but can you see that the shape of the letters, the alphabet, is actually different? This is real Hebrew that we're looking at here. All the Hebrew of the manuscripts and everything that we use now in Hebrew is actually pinched from Aramaic. This is Pucker Hebrew, Old Hebrew, and you can see it's got no dots and dashes, no vowels, and this is probably the earliest biblical manuscript from those that we have in the Dead Sea Scrolls. But if we go to the next picture, we have, this is part of the famous scroll of Isaiah, and I'll talk more about that shortly. But this is in the more familiar form of the letters, the shape of the letters. So the script is familiar, but again, you can see no vowel marks or anything like that. So here we are about 1,000 years before our Masoretic manuscripts. Now, if we can have the next picture, this is simply Joshua chapter 1, verse 1 in a Masoretic manuscript, just as a picture. What difference do the differences make? In other words, does adding all the vowels and the marks to indicate where verses begin and end and that kind of thing, does it make any difference? Well, first of all, it has to be said that the scribes, the people who copied these, and who actually wrote the vowel signs, were very conservative, and as far as they could, they were recording what they had inherited from earlier generations. But even so, having said that, there are times where they understood things differently. The vowels, with any given word, I mean, you can, if you've only got the consonants, you can, in theory, put in lots of different vowels. Normally they make very good sense and so on. But actually, we can prove that sometimes the vowels that they've given cannot have been what Isaiah meant by the vowels, because they indicate a different language form, a different form of syntax or other linguistic form, which didn't actually exist as early as the time when the Bible was first being written. So the differences may not be very great. I'm not trying to exaggerate this for a moment, but however conservative our scribes were who wrote or copied a passage like this, we have to realize that those vowel points and other signs are not necessarily an exact replication of what would have been known originally. Now, it stands to reason that not only the vowels, but also the way you divide up a sentence, which some of the marks indicate, means that they are thinking about what the text says. They're interested in its meaning. And that means that they must be understanding it to mean something, or if you like, interpreting it. And I've written in my notes here, have a little rant about emending the pointing. Because of the distinction between the consonants and the vowels, there was a time in the bad old days, shall we say, when I was young, when people would say, well, you don't have to bother, you can amend the vowels. And I think that's a complete mistake. The scribes, the Masoretes who copied this, meant what they wrote. And I think it's our duty to work out what it is that they did mean by the vowels and the other marks that they put in. It's a branch of scholarship which attracts specialists, and obviously it gets extremely complicated. But it's not as though they wrote mechanically and just made a lot of mistakes in the vowels as they went along. They were working to a system that they understood and that to them made good sense. So we shouldn't, as scholars say, emend the vowels. Now, of course, we're free to disagree with the Masoretes. We can say, well, you had a jolly good try, and I understand what you're saying, but I don't agree with you. That's something quite else. If we want to say that, we're free to do so. But the idea that the vowels don't matter and can be emended away, I think is a great mistake. So we have here two levels within the text. We have the level of what we have here with all the vowels, and which a medieval scholar would study with interest and concern on the one hand, and on the other, we have the consonants, which, as we've seen, go back earlier, but which have sometimes words have come to be spelt a bit differently. So if we now go back to if we can have the next scroll, please. If we go back 1,000 years, here's part of the famous Isaiah scroll. Apart from the little gaps that you can see, it's the complete book of Isaiah, all 66 chapters, as we would call it. It's the only biblical book among the Dead Sea Scrolls that is preserved in its entirety. Otherwise, the scrolls tend to be rather fragmentary. If I show you the next picture, I'll show you some fragments, so you'll see what I mean. many of the scrolls are more like this. And some people complain that it took a long time for everything to be published. If you can imagine, particularly from the famous Cave 4, which is the one you always get in the photographs, of hundreds, literally hundreds of fragments like this. It's like having, 150 jigsaw puzzles all muddled up together and half the pieces missing. And to work out what went where, obviously, took specialists a very long time. But nonetheless, one can see how we have fragments of all the books of the Hebrew Bible except the book of Esther. There doesn't appear to be any fragment left of Esther. Why that should be so, we can speculate. Perhaps it just didn't survive. I mean, there's some of the other books only have tiny fragments. Or is it, as some people think, because it doesn't actually mention the name of God or the word God in the text and therefore wasn't preserved? We don't know. But anyway, all the other books of the Hebrew Bible are included, along, of course, with very many other important texts by whoever was responsible for collecting all this material in the 11 caves that we associate with the Dead Sea Scrolls. And of course, we want to compare how the consonants on scrolls like this link with the Masoretic manuscripts from which our Bibles now are translated. Now, if we just focus for the moment on the book of Isaiah, because we've got that complete scroll, we have other scrolls of Isaiah. In fact, we've got about 18. The second one, which was also published earlier, if we could have the next picture, please, was edited by a scholar called Syriac. Some of you will know his name, but if you don't, you may know him better if I say he was the father of Yigal Yadin. And I mentioned that in this Barnett Memorial Lecture because Yigal Yadin was very supportive and helpful to Richard Barnett when our society was being set up. Yadin was in London on sabbatical, and he and Richard Barnett and David Astor of the Observer newspaper got together to work on all this. And Yadin gave the very first lecture to the society, and I'm told 800 people attended. We've got 159 this evening, so I've got some way to go to catch up with him. Anyway, Syriac edited another scroll of Isaiah. I'll show you a picture now, if I may. The next one, please. This is known as the B scroll of Isaiah. It doesn't cover the whole of the book, but quite a lot of it. And it came also from that first cave that was discovered, the earliest discoveries. And then from cave 4, from the jigsaw puzzles, there are scrolls of another 18 parts of Isaiah. Now, cutting a long story short, if I might put it this way, if one compares this B scroll and also the fragments from cave 4, on the whole, they're pretty close to the consonants of the Masoretic manuscripts that I spoke about before. While the so-called A scroll, the one that's complete, is in a category of its own in having many hundreds of differences. But don't get too alarmed, because of those hundreds of differences, the vast majority are significant and interesting differences of spelling of the same word, often because the scribe who copied the A scroll or whatever was assimilating to Aramaic, which may have been perhaps his or her native language. The famous Israeli scholar Kutcher did an enormous study of this. And so, although there are differences, many of them are of linguistic interest rather than in terms of what the text itself really says. Nevertheless, there are also small differences of greater importance and interest, where there's a genuine difference between a word here and a word in the Masoretic manuscripts. And the Revised Standard Version, which is an English translation that many people have relied on for many years, actually follows the reading of the A scroll rather than of our Masoretic manuscript on, I think it's 15 occasions. You need a magnifying glass to see this, but if you have a copy of the RSV, down at the bottom, in the tiniest print, as though they almost want to hide it, it says reading with one ancient Hebrew manuscript or something like that. And that's the place where they are using a reading from the Qumran scroll rather than from the standard Masoretic manuscript. Let me just give you one example of that. Could we have the next one, please, Rachel? If we take Isaiah chapter 53, verse 11, the familiar Authorized or King James Version, he shall see of the travail of his soul and shall be satisfied. But if you come down to the NRSV, the New Revised Standard, out of his anguish, he shall see light. Now, there's no equivalent of light in the King James or indeed in the Revised Standard Version, but it's there in the NRSV and in the New International Version. After he has suffered, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. Now, what's going on here? Well, the fact of the matter is that in the A scroll and the B scroll, we have the word light after the word see, and also in the Greek translation in the Septuagint, it also has the Greek equivalent for light. Now, I'm going to show you this. You may or may not, depending on how much you Hebrew know. The next, please. Could we have the next? Yes. If you look, for what it's worth, at the fourth line from the bottom, in the middle, I'm sorry, I haven't got a pointer, but right in the middle, fourth line, yeah, just there, you've got he will see, and then if you go just along to the left, the next word is the word for light. And can you see that several of the letters are the same? So arguably, when the Masoretic scribe was writing, his eye jumped from one to the other. The same applies to one of the little fragments from the K4. Could we have the next picture, please? Now, this is a fragment, as you can see, but in the second line down, where there's a bit of a gap and a hole, but if you work it all out, the word light has to be in there in order to make sense of the gaps. So there's a very strong argument from several of our earliest Hebrew scrolls and the Greek translation that the original text had, after he's suffered, he will see light, which is an image we get in the Psalms for meaning to live, and that the version that's come down to us, that word got left out. Now, how common is it for a word to get left out? Well, not all that common, but we actually know that it happens sometimes, and I'm going to prove it to you now with the next picture. This is a little bit of a commentary on the book of Habakkuk. And as you know, you read Hebrew from right to left. So if you see the top line, you've got one word, then you've got another word, and then you've got a word written in above. Do you see? Which is actually the same as the word that it comes after. Because they're two different words, but they're spelt the same in the consonants. This says, and God spoke to Habakkuk. So one of those copies is the word for God, and the other word that's been added in above the line is the word to. So God spoke to Habakkuk. And I think it's fairly obvious that what happened was the scribe was writing, and he'd written that word once, and he looked up, and maybe he'd had a bad night, or I don't know, the coffee was not very nice or something, and he just left it out, and then he came back and said, oh, bother, I've left it out. And he's written the word in there above. interestingly, if you go to the very end of that line on the left-hand side, you can see two letters, one of which has got a long tail up. Yes, that's al. And then if you go to the next line on the right-hand side, can you see the same word? And that's not meant to be there. So there, this scribe was having a bad day. He had actually written the same word twice by mistake. Now, if you like technical terms, the first example is a case of haplography. In other words, the word was written once when it should have been written twice. And the other one is ditography, where it should have been written once, but actually got written twice. So we know from all this that in copying, it is possible to make such mistakes, and that can help us to explain why the texts might be different. Now, so far, all we've seen has been fairly straightforward. We have our Masoretic manuscripts from which our Bibles are translated, which mostly reflect pretty closely, more or less, what we've seen in the case of Isaiah. There are some differences, which most of you probably reading the NRSV had never even noticed, or the RSV, where the different reading is followed. It doesn't upset the apple cart. It makes us a little bit closer to the original, but that's as far as it goes. However, in the case of some other books, the situation is a bit different. If we could have the next slide, please. This is a fragment of the book of Jeremiah. Now, long before the scrolls were discovered, I always like to think they were first discovered on my birthday, the 15th of July, 1947. It was certainly that summer anyway. So before that, so before I was born, we knew already from the Greek translation of the book of Jeremiah that things were rather different. First of all, the translation is about 18% shorter than the Hebrew text that we're familiar with. And secondly, the order of one or two of the chapters is different between the Greek and the Hebrew. That had been known for a long time. People used to talk about it, and there could be arguments, oh, the translator was just playing fast and loose with his text or something like that. And others said, no, there must have been a different Hebrew text. Well, we don't have a lot of Jeremiah among the Dead Sea Scrolls, but we do have just enough to demonstrate that the Greek translator was working from a Hebrew text. He wasn't playing fast and loose and changing things for the sake of it. He was translating a shorter form of the Hebrew text, which means that there must have been, if you like to put it like this, two editions of Jeremiah in circulation, a shorter one and a longer one. And usually speaking, scholars, I think quite rightly, argue that the shorter is the earlier, because the longer one, it's not that huge amounts of text have been added in terms of whole sentences. It's very often a word here and a word there. In the early version, it says, Jeremiah said this. In the longer version, it says, Jeremiah the prophet said this. Or in the earlier version, it might say Nebuchadnezzar. And in the long version, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, did something. So it looks as though, and most people take this view, I think correctly, that the, if you like to call it, the second edition has added these little explanatory words to the text rather than the reverse, which would be pretty odd if somebody went through cutting out the prophet and the king of Babylon everywhere. This raises an interesting question for those who move within traditional Christian circles, because very often statements of faith talk about the importance or the inspiration of the Bible as originally given. In other words, they recognize that sometimes mistakes may have been made in copying, and so what we want to get back is to the original. Now, in the case of Isaiah, we've seen how that can almost be done. But in the case of Jeremiah, as originally given, is very different. I mean, you've got something that's a lot shorter, nearly a fifth shorter, and with things in a different order. So as originally given actually takes you away from the Bible that is normally used. So Jeremiah is a problem. Well, not a problem, it's an interesting case. And perhaps the most dramatic one, which is the last one I'll just refer to, is the book of Samuel. If you could have the next picture, please. On the right, you've got a picture of some of the fragments of the book of Samuel. And on the left, you've got the text, and you can see, even without Hebrew, that there's lots of square brackets. And the square brackets are round things which are not in the scroll, but they've been filled in on the basis of our knowledge of the text from the Hebrew, from the Masoretic manuscripts. So you can often do that, you can fill it in, but what you've actually got is the fragments, and lots more than just these ones I've shown on that side. Now, again, in the Hebrew text of the book of Samuel, there are lots of places where there are real difficulties. It's difficult to know how to translate them because it just doesn't seem to make sense. And the Septuagint, again, the Greek translation, was long known to offer some possible solutions. Let me give you an example. If I could have the next slide, please. Here is a verse from 1 Samuel chapter 1 in the Greek translation, well, a translation of the of the Greek. And the boy was with them, and that's Samuel, and they brought him before the Lord, and his father killed the sacrifices year by year to the Lord, and he brought the boy to la la la. Now, in the Masoretic text, we have just, and the boy, a boy, which in older English translations is translated something like the boy was young, or something like that. Actually, for the Hebrew word here, it's not really a boy. It means somebody who has not yet achieved mature independence. So sometimes it's translated a lad or something like that. But the lad was a lad, the boy a boy. What do you do with that? Well, we've got the Greek translation here, and you can see the boy at the start and you can see the boy at the end. And it seems a perfectly reasonable guess that when the scribe was copying this text, his eye jumped from the boy at the top to the boy at the end and simply left out the stuff in between. And although this particular passage is not preserved completely among the Dead Sea Scrolls, enough of it is to show that it supports some sort of solution like that. And one can repeat that sort of thing in many other places. So in the case of Samuel, the manuscripts that we have from which our Bibles are translated do seem to be defective in a number of places, but by a combination of the Greek and the Dead Sea Scrolls, we can sometimes put them back better together. And then if we could just go to my last picture, please. I want just to say a word about the Samaritan Pentateuch. This is the Samaritan high priest some while ago, holding up a very treasured copy of the Torah, which they have. And as most people know, the Samaritans have what we would call the Pentateuch or the Torah, which they revere as their scripture. And of course, we compare it with our Torah, and the differences fall into two groups. One are lots of little differences of the sort we might have seen with Isaiah, and one can debate which is better. Whereas on the other hand, there are 2 or 3 places where a significant amount is added, for instance, to the 10 Commandments, saying you must have your sanctuary on Mount Gerizim, which is where the Samaritans have their place of worship. Now, it used to be said that the Samaritan Pentateuch, therefore, was sort of, I don't know what you want to say, different and so on. But the interesting thing is that among the Dead Sea Scrolls, whoever they were, clearly a Jewish group, many of the fragments of the Pentateuch, as it were, agree with the Samaritan Pentateuch in the small differences, not in the big bits, but in the small differences. So it's clear that the Samaritans had a text of the Torah, which was also shared amongst their Jewish neighbors. And this is really an interesting contribution to the whole revision of our understanding of who the Samaritans are. It's clear that they were working closely with the Jerusalem group until more or less the completion of the Torah, 5th, 4th century, whenever you want to put that. Whereas, although they added one or two other bits, their text is shared. And this is another aspect of what the Dead Sea Scrolls have taught us about the text of the Bible. So to answer my question, how well has the Bible survived? It's a mixed picture. I think generally it's reasonably reassuring, given that the differences spread over at least 1,000 years. Occasionally, if I was trying to teach the undergraduates, I'd say that goes back in this country to before the time of William the Conqueror. That's a very long time during which these precious texts were being copied out by hand. And over that long period of time, as we've seen, there's no question that they were so mistaken that everything was changed, or that there was all kinds of other stuff that was brought in. The communities in the synagogue and then later in the church were careful in the preservation of this material. But there are some cases, like Jeremiah and Samuel, where there's a greater variety of books or editions which seem to have existed side by side. What I find interesting is that the community from whom we get the Dead Sea Scrolls, they didn't write the Bible, they were copies which they had, as it were, in their library. They had these different versions side by side, sometimes, as it were, even in the same cave. And the question arises whether they were bothered by the differences or not. And as far as I can see, they weren't very bothered by it. And in that commentary on Habakkuk that I mentioned, there are some differences where they have one version in the text and the alternative is what they comment on. So they seem to try and live with different texts. The versions which survive to become our Masoretic text and therefore our Hebrew Bible must have been the copy that was treasured by the particular community that survived the disaster of 70, the Christian era and the destruction of Jerusalem and so on, and they were cherished as authoritative. Of course, we have to bear in mind that for most of the centuries between the time of composition or editing of the biblical books and the actual evidence we have even from the Dead Sea Scrolls is quite a long time, about which we know very little. We can only hazard guesses on the basis of scholarship. But on the basis of the evidence that we do have, the text is generally pretty stable, given the length of time over which it was being copied, and we have to deal responsibly with those places where there are interesting and important differences. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Hugh. We have some time for questions, if you're happy to take them, and then I will hand over to Tessa, who will give the vote of thanks, if that's okay, Tessa. From Eliyahu, you say the Masoretes copied their teachers. I prefer to say they copied what they heard from the readers. I'm a scribe from the Dead Sea, but I actually live in a kibbutz next to Gaza. Saad.
Thank you. I'm not going to disagree with what you're suggesting. In an oral lecture, which I just was speaking freely, one uses language to try and make it intelligible. Sometimes there are differences, small differences, which, as you imply, look as though they come from what you hear rather than what you see. And so that is an important thing. Sometimes perhaps there was a dictation and you had maybe 2 or 3 scribes copying from dictation. Other times, though, the Masoretic manuscripts as we receive them now are so sophisticated in not only in their the vowel points, but also in the divisions and the accents and so on. I don't need to tell you this, that it looks to me as though it's a much more literary activity. But I don't disagree that they heard, and that tradition was transmitted pretty faithfully over many hundreds of years.
Thank you very much.
Ken Edwards asks, are there different Masoretic words which decompose with vowels removed to the same consonants?
There are words which you can with the same consonants and different vowels, and sometimes, for instance, the Greek translation is obviously going with one, and the Masoretes have got the one that comes immediately to mind is the word davar, a word for a word, but it can also be deva, meaning a plague, with different, and so sometimes you can get differences like that. I think one can always consider which is, so to speak, correct, and we have to go on the basis of sense in the context, exegetical sense, the translations in the versions, and so on, to make a decision. But yes, the same consonants can produce different words if you put different vowels to it.
Geoffrey Ben Nathan, do you have any views about the Samaritan text of the Torah? This may have been posed before you talked about it. How should we put it in context?
Yes, I mean, I did just touch on it at the end. There has been a real revolution in Samaritan studies in the last 20 or 30 years, and who they were and where they came from is a matter of great interest. We have the sort of evidence from Josephus and so on that they were all those who'd come from the Assyrians brought in, and they were all pagans and so on. Whereas the evidence is, I think, that they were included descendants of the old northern kingdom of Israel, joined myself, I think, with a priestly group who exited Jerusalem, probably sometime in the Persian period, and went to the old sanctuary at Shechem, Mount Gerizim, which after all is mentioned in the Pentateuch as the place where you should build your altar and so on. And they came together there, and the real divide, I think myself, came when John Hyrcanus, late 2nd century BCE, went and destroyed their temple. And that's not a very popular thing to do, to go around destroying other people's temples. So after that, relationships got pretty bad. Why a group of priests might have left, I mean, if the community at Qumran was a breakaway group because they didn't think those in Jerusalem were being strict enough, my view is that there was, earlier than that, there was a group who were amongst the elite, and the priests were amongst the elite, who wanted open trade and an economy with the northern part of the country, which was more prosperous. But there was a time when there was a very, very narrow and strict interpretation of who you could deal with. And I think that could well have caused a division. And so the priestly line, the Samaritan priestly line, has a very good claim to be, so to speak, historically authentic, if I can put it like that. And clearly before the divide, they were working on the text of the Torah together. And so many of the differences we do now find attested also among the Dead Sea Scrolls. So this was a shared text, suggesting closer collaboration to a later date than we used to think. So I suspect that in probably the 5th century, a separate community, as it were, developed, combining a priestly group with the old inhabitants of the northern kingdom, or part of them, but still working closely together. From the Elephantine texts, you remember in Egypt, when they want to rebuild their temple down there in southern Egypt, they write to Samaria and Jerusalem and the priests there as though they're both important. So they seem to be working in common there. It was only much later that a real divide came, particularly, I think, because of John Hyrcanus. But one has to understand that one is putting here together hard evidence, texts and scrolls that we actually have in our hands, with circumstantial evidence to try and explain how it happens. And so as a historian, I don't think we often distinguish sufficiently between we've actually got evidence for something, hard evidence, as it were, and where we're offering an explanation to explain the hard data. And I think the Samaritans are a good case in point for that. But I'm rather fond of them, as many people are. And as I say, if you look in the literature, you'll find that there's been really quite a change in how the Samaritans are understood in the last 2 or 3 decades.
Thank you. There's a couple of comments which you don't necessarily need to answer, but Edith Goldman's point about there being an infamous photo of Sukenik working on the Dead Sea Scrolls with a cigarette it does remind us of the perils of transmission. And Elizabeth Freed has her own theory which she shares about why Esther was not found at Qumran, and that is because she suggests the date on which Esther says, "Let us kill everyone who's trying to kill us," falls on a Saturday according to the Qumran calendar, which is new one to me.
I hadn't heard that before, but it's something to think about.
And then Anthony Raven, our treasurer, has a long point here. Mention of the fashion to amend the Masoretic text reminds me of the story of the great 19th century scholar Heinrich Gretz, who was invited to London in 1887, and while there to read the Pentateuchal text on the Sabbath at the New West End Synagogue, Gretz proceeded to give the reading, amending the Masoretic text as he went along, to the horror of the congregation, who viewed the text as sacrosanct.
I didn't know that particular story, but it's a very nice one. The trend in scholarly work of Gretz, obviously a very important figure, has changed. If you go back 100 years or more, it was before the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. It was before we knew anything about the language of Ugarit, which is very close to Hebrew from the Syrian coast from the 2nd millennium BCE. It was almost before Akkadian had been properly deciphered. It was before many inscriptions that we now have and other materials were discovered. So scholars, when they came across a difficulty in the Hebrew text, and there are some difficulties, as any of you who read it will know, what could they do? Well, they looked to their friends in the Department of Classics, who were very gaily amending their Latin or their Greek texts if they could, because it made better sense. And they did the same. And the first thing I just want to say about that is, my goodness, they knew their Hebrew. If you can look at a text that's difficult and say, if I just change this letter, everything falls into place. They really knew what they were doing. But the evidence we have now, both from the scrolls in terms of the textual evidence, but also from our greater knowledge of related languages, so that sometimes a word that seemed so difficult, now actually we can say, well, that's because you thought it meant this, and actually we know it means that, and then everything's fine, has made a great difference. So there is still a place for possible emendation. I have little doubt about that. But we are much more cautious now than our Victorian forebears were.
Question from Samuel Levine. Do you see any theological implications to the variants? In other words, are there any particular verses on which significant theological principles are hung that would be altered by variant readings?
It depends how theological you want to get and which sort of theology. There are some texts, I mean, Isaiah 53 would be a good case in point, where obviously in the Christian church, that's been a very important passage, where some people think the Hebrew text is very difficult. It does have some challenges, but they're not as great as a lot of people try to make out, because they don't want the text to say what it appears to say. So theology can come into it. On small detail, references to the way, well, the ways, for instance, that God is referred to. If the God of Israel is called the Bull of Jacob, they don't think that's very nice nowadays. So they put a different vowel in and make it the strong one of Israel, or something like that. So in small ways like that, yes. But if by your question you mean have whole hunks of the Bible been rewritten in order to accommodate a theological one, I think the evidence is no. We have evidence of simple copying errors as we go along, and so on. We have evidence of changes to the way words may be vocalized in order to accommodate them, as it were, to orthodoxy. But in terms of significant rewriting, I would say no.
Thank you. A couple of questions on the Aleppo Codex. Has it made any significant difference to our biblical text? And is it earlier than the Leningrad
Yes,
Codex?
the Aleppo Codex, which is being published by the Hebrew University Bible Project, is earlier than Leningrad, and I don't get into this level of detail in my study of Masoretic matters, but there are some who say it's superior to Leningrad. It's very, very similar. The only difference is that it's not complete. Leningrad is the earliest complete manuscript. The Aleppo Codex has lost some bits, one reason or another. It's had a checkered history, including being rescued from Damascus much earlier on, and so on, and seems to have lost some bits along the way. So it's an important manuscript, and so far the Hebrew University Bible Project, which has been working on the prophets where it's preserved, and that's fine. The interesting question will be, what will they do when they get to Genesis, where it doesn't all survive? And that's a problem that they will no doubt have to face in about 30 years' time at the rate of progress that they're making. So yes, it's a bit earlier. It hasn't made a significant difference. No, it's very, very similar to the Leningrad. It's the same school of scribes, but there are some slight differences where people sometimes think it's superior.
There's rather a massive question next, I think. To what extent did canonization affect scribal variety?
Canonization, in my opinion, and there's lots of others here, it's not that they sort of put all the possibilities out on the desk and said, we'll have this one and not that one. Canonization was simply an acknowledgement by the community that we value and treasure this text. So it's a recognition of what the community had already accepted as valuable. And of course, there are differences, as we know, in the Roman Catholic Church, for instance. Some texts are included as at least deuterocanonical, which would not be in the Jewish or the Protestant tradition. So, as I say, canonization is a recognition, and there can be some squabbles at the borders, whether Song of Songs gets in or not, or something like that. But on the whole, it's not dictating something, it's recognizing what's already acknowledged by the community. So I would say myself that the texts that were accepted as canonical, at whatever date you want to put that, were already accepted. So they happened to be the text form that that community was working with, which in our case would be the predecessor of the Masoretic text. So that's why we're, quote, lumbered with the texts of Samuel and Jeremiah and some others, which, because they happen to be the ones that survived in the dominant community. So I think the answer, if I'm not mistaken, the answer to your question is no. Is that? Yeah.
Are you happy to take a few more questions, Hugh? We've fired a lot at you, but
I'm all right for the time being.
okay.
If people want to go, that's I should quite understand.
Well, there've been a lot of very positive comments from people who have left saying thank you very much. But yes, here's a question. The fragments you showed seem to have spaces between the words. When were spaces added? And how much effect would the lack of spaces have had on the interpretation of the text?
It's a difficult question to answer authoritatively. It used to be thought that the texts were written with continuous script, but there's actually no evidence for that. And mostly where we have inscriptions and things from, from Bible times, they put a dot between words or divide them like that. Now, sometimes they may have left out a dot, and there are one or two cases. There's a famous one in the book of Amos, I forget the exact reference, where it's quite clear that what should be two words have been run together to make one word, and the result is rather ridiculous. But on the whole, all the evidence we have is that individual words were distinguished and separate as far back as we can know. Whether it's because they had gaps between them, or whether it's because they put a dot or something like that, we don't have the evidence to tell us. But certainly the comparative evidence from inscriptions and so on from earlier centuries is that words were already being distinguished in one way or another.
Thank you. So if we can have one final question from Drew Longacre. Do you have a general impression of which books or corpora were better transmitted and which are more problematic?
Not quite sure which way this question's going. I've indicated I've given you two extreme examples of ones where we happen to have inherited a less good copy than we assume was originally written, in the case of Samuel and Jeremiah. And to that one can add, perhaps not quite so dramatically, but books like Joshua. In the case of, for instance, the Torah, where we have quite a number of bits of scrolls from Qumran, from the Dead Sea Scrolls, even there, although they're very similar to what we have now, you will sometimes find differences, as attested also by the Samaritan Pentateuch. So, excuse me, I don't have a checklist, as it were, for each one. And I don't like necessarily to say that what was better preserved. I mean, that implies that some people were deliberately careless, and some people were more conscientious in their copying or writing. I think they were all conscientious. I just think that sometimes a scribe had a bad day, and things got out of order. But no text is identical in every copy that we have, whether it be the Pentateuch or the prophets or anything else. We know that they lived with variety, and it doesn't seem to have bothered them that much. It's only perhaps later that the idea of the inspiration of individual words, when that becomes a theological dogma, then of course all this variety becomes a problem. And in fact, when old Kennicott was working in the 18th century or 17th century, there was a great argument about whether the vowel points were inspired. And part of his work in collecting all the data was to show, well, if it did, you've got a real problem here, because sometimes the vowels are different. I find this a difficult question to answer. We have the evidence we have. Some texts seem to have a more unified tradition, even though there will be differences. Others, the copy that happens to have survived seems to have been, we would judge as 21st century people, less well copied. As I say, I don't have a sort of graph with all the variations on it. I've tried to give you the two sides of the coin to make the point clear, and to work with the texts I've likely all do that I'm most familiar with.
Hugh,
But
thank
that's not
you.
a very satisfactory answer. There we are.
No, it's a wonderful answer, and thank you so much for your generosity with the answers, and a wonderful lecture. But I'm going to hand over to Tessa Rajak now to make the closing remarks. Thank you, Tessa.
Well, I think my contribution is going to be more of a nuisance than the person was who added stuff to the text of Jeremiah that we don't need to have to deal with, but do. It really ought to be more like the Septuagint translators who added nothing and took nothing away. And thank you, Hugh. That really was an absolutely perfect lecture. The perfect lecture from a teacher, from a scholar of great depth, and from somebody who can at the same time give us so many nuances, convey the complexities, and make it utterly simple and intelligible. There can't be anybody whose mind hasn't been improved this evening, as is shown by really the remarkable quantity and quality of the questions. We don't always have that by any means, and we could have gone on and on. This is also an occasion, the Richard Barnett Memorial Lecture, to reflect and appreciate our society and its origins, and what we are still doing, and even give ourselves a bit of a pat on the back, and express appreciation. And I think there is nobody really that we should be appreciating more than Hugh. It's a pleasure to do that in Barbara Barnett's presence, and Hugh gave ample credit and a lovely sketch of Richard Barnett. But I can assure everybody that, having delved a little into the history of the society and been Hugh's successor but one, is that right? I'm not sure. Anyway, I can assure you that he has done more, much more over the years than go to committee meetings where you had nothing to do except eat delicious food and have a drink or two. Indeed, I would say there's nobody who has, sometimes from up front, sometimes just quietly, but completely unintrusively, contributed more to making sure that we are still here and flourishing, and whatever the times and circumstances around us, feeling that we have work to do and pleasure to glean from thinking about archaeology in the very broadest sense, the archaeology of Israel and always of the surrounding region, and that too Hugh has always been clear about. Really, what more can I say? Oh, I should also add, we had plenty of Hugh's inimitable humour, which made the whole thing such a huge pleasure. I don't think we've, in my time, ever had a better Barnett lecture. That was absolutely terrific. And that we are here now, Hugh, as I say, is in very large measure thanks to you, and looking forward to a great year ahead, which our chair, Sarah Pearce, has ably organised. So thank you also to Sarah for putting all this together, and to Sheila, and to our wonderful and huge audience. And good evening, everybody.